Again, everyone, Pastor Tom here, and this is week 2. It's a summary of the Light of the World Zoom groups that I have been leading, and I realize that not everyone is able to attend one of these groups, doesn't work out in your schedule, or for whatever reason you can't be there. So this is a quick way to get the teachings that are offered in this particular study. They are by Pastor Andy Stanley, who is awesome. And so we give you those teachings, and then I ask you just a few questions to be thinking about related to that teaching to help you get the most from this. So before I play the first teaching by Pastor Stanley, I'm going to ask you just to think with me, like I asked the group members in the Zoom meetings, who are some of the main characters that you can think of in the Christmas story? So think about the Christmas story, and who or what are some of the main characters? Well, some of the characters that the groups mentioned were, of course, Mary and Joseph. Some mentioned the wise men or the shepherds. Every group mentioned Herod. Some people mentioned the innkeeper. And I ask this because Pastor Stanley starts off his message by just asking the people who they relate to in the story, who they relate to the most. So with that in mind, let's go to the first segment of Pastor Stanley's teaching.
I want to tell you the story of the person I identify most closely with in the Christmas story. Now, if I were to ask you, and this would be an odd question, who do you identify with most closely in the Christmas story? Mary? I don't think so. Joseph? Don't know much about him. The shepherds? They were scared. The wise men, the magi, what is that? So if I were to ask you, baby Jesus? No, okay? So who do you identify with? And I would have to tell you, and I hope this will become clear as we go along, the person that honestly I most closely identify with in the Christmas story is who we might consider the villain of Christmas, King Herod. And I'll tell you why in just a few minutes. But I believe that for most of us, there's a little King Herod in all of us. Now, King Herod was the client king of Judea, which meant Rome and made him the king of Judea. He wasn't even Jewish, which of course drove all the Jewish people crazy. He was the king of Judea in the time that Christ was born. He was very smart, very talented, very politically astute, very, very ambitious. He was known in that day and age as a builder because he rebuilt the Jewish temple. He built port cities. He built aqueducts. He built all kinds of things. He was an extraordinary person when it came to his talent. But the thing that got him in trouble was that he was so committed to his own control and so committed to his own legacy that he just made bad decision after bad decision after bad decision. He changed his will 4 times. He had 10 wives. He had a bunch of sons, and every few years he would decide, oh, no, you're the right son to be the king, change his will, and then that son wouldn't work out, so we'd have that son executed. Say, no, you're going to be, so after a while the sons were like, that's okay, Dad, I don't even want to be a king. But he was so committed to controlling the kingdom, growing his kingdom, and what he wanted was a legacy. He wanted forever and ever and ever there to be someone who was related to him sitting on the throne of Judea. He killed one of his wives. He murdered so many rabbis in Jerusalem and so many rabbis in Judea that rabbis didn't even want to come anywhere close to the city of Jerusalem, because when King Herod got mad, he would do whatever he wanted to do to maintain control of his kingdom and to control his legacy. Now, when we get to the biblical narrative about the birth of Jesus, King Herod is about 70 years old, and he has a kidney disease, a painful kidney disease. He's very, very sick. He's trying to consolidate his power. He's trying to ensure that the next generation carries on his legacy, and then he gets the most disturbing news imaginable. 5 miles south of him, there's a new king. And this new king is learning to walk. And here's how Matthew introduces the story. Matthew writes, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, where King Herod is king, during the time of King Herod, Magi, or we call them wise men when we were growing up, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and they asked. Now imagine how this landed. They're wandering around the city of Jerusalem asking this question. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Shh. Where is the one who has been born? We came to Jerusalem because it's the capital city. We know we're close. Where is the one that has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it arose and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. Now that you know a little background, you understand why the whole city was disturbed when he was disturbed. Because when King Herod was disturbed, it was dangerous. When King Herod was disturbed, he was likely to do anything. And now he's an older man. And now he's in pain. And suddenly his legacy and his future and his control of the kingdom is at risk. The story continues. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, and you got to imagine this, because whenever you got called to be in front of King Herod, if you were a Jew, you were scared. So now he's calling all the people who've got all the power, all the religious insight. He calls them into one meeting, and he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said to him, in Bethlehem. And they're thinking, you should know this. You're like the King of the Jews. Everybody knows this. Every little Jewish boy knows this passage from the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible. In Bethlehem, in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, this had been predicted many, 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 many years before. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. This is like the worst news imaginable. Then Herod, the story continues, then Herod called the Magi secretly. He said, I want to talk to those guys. And he found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. And then he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, as soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. And after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they, the Magi, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Now, this word worship, this is a word that, in modern church, we make it synonymous with singing. It's not singing. Worship is recognizing that you are in the presence of someone who should cause you to have awe, and then essentially doing whatever you need to do physically or mentally to surrender yourself or to submit yourself to them. So these very wealthy men who had traveled a long, long way, they're in the presence of a baby who has no actual physical power, but because of who they believe this baby was, they dropped to their knees and they worshiped. And 5 miles away, Herod is worried to death. Have you seen those guys? Anybody seen those guys? Have you seen those guys? I want you to stand out on the road. Tell me as soon as you see those guys. Because he's so worried about controlling things. His whole life has been built around preserve, protect, and control. Preserve, protect, and control. Preserve, protect, and control. So with his fist clenched, racked with pain, he's not about to bow his knee to anyone. He's not about to worship anyone or anything. And that's why I say there's a little Herod in all of us. Because, I'm like you, I understand this. I don't mind leveraging God if God's going to help me build my kingdom, right? But the whole idea of writing God or writing anyone a blank check with my life, the whole idea of worshiping, of surrendering, of saying the answer is yes. Now, what was the question? That doesn't come natural to any of us, does it? Because there's a little Herod in all of us. The story continues. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, the Magi rather, they returned to their country by another route. And when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. And he said, get up, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. And stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up and took the child and his mother, and during the night, and they left for Egypt. Can you kind of hear the soundtrack in the background building up? The story continues. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And when Herod was furious, people suffered. And when Herod was furious, people died. Because he had spent his whole life, now men, listen to this. He had spent his whole life controlling outcomes. No matter what happened, he had always been able to figure out a way to control the outcome. Even when he had bet on the wrong leader of Rome, he figured out a way. He was bold enough and crafty enough to figure out a way to even control that outcome. He was the master of controlling outcomes. And once again, he thought he had figured out how to outsmart destiny. And he had been outsmarted by a baby and a couple of Jewish parents. But he had decided that no matter what happened, he would not be thwarted, and he certainly would not be thwarted in the end by a baby king. And so he gave these orders that we can't even imagine giving. He gave instructions to his soldiers that we can't even imagine them following through on, unless you know the story of King Herod. And he gave orders to kill all the boys. If you're not going to bring me the one, if you're not going to identify the location of the one, then we'll just opt for the nuclear option. We will just kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. And so they did. One horrible morning or one horrible afternoon or one horrible evening, his soldiers rolled into the little tiny town of Bethlehem and went into every single house and every single hut in the surrounding area, every farmhouse, and pulled out any little boy that looked like he could be of that age and murdered him in front of his family and murdered family members if they got in the way. And Mary lived with the knowledge of that her entire life. Can you imagine that?
Now that's something I hadn't really thought of ever before, and that is how Mary and Joseph dealt with what Herod had done to the babies in Bethlehem, and how that they would have carried that throughout their lifetimes, just thinking about that awful tragedy. So here's some questions also that I want to bring up now, and that is, how much do you struggle with what Pastor Stanley mentioned? He mentioned 3 words, and those words are preserve, protect, and control. How much do you struggle with those in a negative way? Because this is what the pastor was saying that Herod struggled with, and it's also why he said there's a little bit of Herod in all of us. Now, my groups tended to bring out the fact that preserve, protect, and control aren't necessarily bad things, and they're not. For instance, if you're a parent, you have to protect and control, and it's kind of part of life that there are times when we have to do all 3 of those. But yet it becomes a problem when we talk about getting in the way of what God wants to do in our life, and we in effect basically say, God, this is my life, this is my kingdom, and I am going to preserve what I've been able to acquire this far, and I'm going to protect it with everything I can. And if anyone gets in the way, I'm going to, make sure that they get out of the way. And also, I'm going to control the outcome related to my day, my 24 hours. I'm going to even try to control the future if I can. I'm going to control as much of it as I can, because I really don't want to leave you with a blank check and allow you to write whatever outcome you want for my day. Now that's where it becomes problematic. By the way, King Herod was a Roman citizen. However, he was raised in Jewish teaching, which was kind of interesting. So he understood the teachings of the Jewish people. He didn't believe in them, wasn't sympathetic toward the Jewish way of life. But this is why the Roman leaders put him in as the king of Judea, because they thought, here's a guy who kind of knows the Jewish people, but we're going to put him there because he's a Roman, and he's going to help keep the Jewish people in Judea under control, if you will. And, if there's any uprisings, he's going to stomp that out, and he's going to protect us from them uprising against the Roman Empire. And so because of that, the Jewish people didn't like him at all. And also because he was just such a ruthless, hateful person, and he was so dominated by his desire to preserve, protect, and control. Okay, let's go back to part 2 now of Pastor Stanley's message.
But here's what happened. Soon, very soon, in fact, probably within that same year, Herod died a terribly painful death because of this kidney disease. In fact, it was so painful, he tried to commit suicide. Now, committing suicide in ancient times, committing suicide in the first century was very difficult. Very difficult to commit suicide. And committing suicide in the first century was very painful. But the pain of his disease was so bad that he did not want to live, even though it meant inflicting more pain on himself. And just as he was killing himself, his cousin walked in and saved him. And he continued to suffer. Just before he died, Herod gave a command. He said, I want you to round up all the wealthy, influential, distinguished men in Jerusalem. I want you to round them all up, put them all in prison. And in the hour that I die, you are to execute all of these distinguished men so that someone will be mourning on the day that I die. Because he knew when he died, there would be a party to beat all parties in the streets of Jerusalem. Herod died, and they released all those influential men and didn't follow his orders. The text continues. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, once again, second time, get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. For those who were trying to take the child's life are dead. And in this little twist of history, Herod, because he was known as Herod the Great, Herod the king of Judea, Herod the Great, in this incredible twist of fate that we believe was providential, Herod the Great, this is amazing, Herod the Great, who did so many amazing things, Herod the Great becomes a footnote in the story of Jesus, the toddler. And can you imagine trying to explain that to him the last few hours he was alive? To say, hey, Herod, I've got some good news and some bad news. The good news is this, 2,000 plus years from now, people will still be telling a story about you. That's fantastic. In fact, Herod, all over the world in languages you can't imagine, in places that haven't even been discovered yet, people will gather in rows and in circles, and they're going to read a story, and they're going to read about you. That's fantastic. No, that's the good news. The bad news is you're simply a B character. You're simply a sidebar. You're simply a footnote in the story of the toddler who became the king, who became the savior of the world. And people won't talk about what you built. And people won't talk about the seaport. And people won't talk about the aqueducts. You won't be known in most circles as Herod the builder. You'll be known as Herod the butcher. And you were 5 miles away from the birth of the Son of God. And you missed your opportunity. 80 years later, so Herod's long gone. 80 years later, Jesus grew up to be a man, performed miracles, died on the cross, rose from the dead, ascended to be with the Father. 80 years later, Caesar's long gone, Tiberius is gone, Nero is gone. The temple has been completely destroyed. It was just scraped off that Temple Mount. All that work, all those years, all the glory of the Jewish temple that Herod spent so many years and so much of his life developing, it's all gone. 80 years later, John the apostle, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, who actually took Mary from the foot of the cross and took her as his own mom, and she took him as her own son. John, who heard the birth narratives over and over. John, who had the opportunity to say to Mary, Mary, what was it like fleeing to Egypt, knowing that perhaps the children that you left behind in Bethlehem would come to no good? Mary, what was it like when you heard the news that friends of yours had lost their children because of your son, Jesus? Mary, what was it like? He heard these stories. He took care of Mary. John, who saw every miracle. John, who watched Jesus do things no one had ever done before. John, who watched Jesus die. John, who peered into an empty tomb. John, who saw a resurrected Savior. He's an old man, and he's looking back on all of this narrative. He's heard it all firsthand, and he decides to sit down and summarize it. And here's what he said, and here's why this is so relevant for us, and this is why you got to pay attention to that thing in your heart, your soul, your mind that every once in a while just kind of elbows you in the conscience. He says this, in him, this baby of Bethlehem who grew to be a man, who was his friend, in him was, past tense, life. And that life was, past tense, the light of all mankind, not just the Jews, but everybody. Because, at first we thought it was just the Jews. We thought it was just for us. We thought he was just our Jewish Messiah. And then we remembered the day he said, no, you are to go into all the world and you're to teach everything I've taught you to all the world. I'm not just a Jewish Messiah. I realize now looking back that the whole temple has been destroyed, all that's gone on, that this was a message. He had come for all mankind. And then he pauses. And he chooses to move from the past tense, this is what I'd seen, this is what I've believed, this is what I experienced, to the present tense, to send you a message and to send me a message. He was the light and life of all mankind, and the light shines right now in the darkness. And the light shines. He's been exiled to Patmos. It looks like the Romans have won. It looks like the ancient Jewish temple will never be resurrected, and ancient Judaism is gone forever. He's lost all of his friends. And yet he looks back on what he experienced and he says, you know what? That life, that light continues to shine right now. And then he punctuates it with this powerful remark. And the darkness has not swallowed it up, overcome it. The darkness has not blown it out. And that brings us to you. What will your story be? What will your story be in relationship to the light of the world? What will your story be in relationship to the light of the world? Will it be a story of resistance? Or will you, taking your cue from the wise men, the Magi, will your story be a story of worship? Will it be a story that you spent your whole life like Herod trying to build a kingdom instead of accepting an invitation to participate in the kingdom of God? Will your story be that you clung as tightly as you could to all the things that eventually you would have to give up anyway? Or will it be a story of a man or a woman who surrendered everything that came their way because they realized it wasn't even theirs to begin with? Will your life and will your story be a story about my way or God's way, my will or thy will? And the reason there's a tension and the reason there's a struggle is because we're human and there is a little Herod in all of us. But one day, you know this, one day, someday, somebody will be forced to tell your story in relationship to the story of the light of the world. And they will either have to make something up or they'll be able to tell the true story of how at some point in your life, even though you had drifted, even though you had lost hope, even though the life had just sort of stomped all the faith and all the light and all the life out of you, that at some point in your life, you recognize that there was still a light because one day somebody will tell your story in relationship to the light of the world. And the question you have to answer and that I have to answer is, what story do we want told? And here's the good news. I mean, this is amazing. Think about this, and I don't know you. The good news is this: the darkness has not overcome that light in you, has it? The darkness, all that you've experienced, all that you've seen, all the disappointment, all the unanswered prayer, all the people who didn't do what they were supposed to do, all the hypocrisy maybe you've seen in the church, whatever it is, all of that darkness still has not overcome the light that is in you. And it's why you're listening today, and it's why you're here today. And it's why this message is just getting on your nerves. And it's why every once in a while you find yourself having conversations with a God you're not even sure you believe in anymore. It's because the darkness cannot overwhelm it, overcome it. The darkness cannot blow it out. And so I urge you this Christmas season, would you consider taking even a small baby step of re-engaging with the light of the world, the light of life?
So the interesting thing here is that even though Herod wanted so much to have a legacy that he could leave behind that would be impressive, his biggest legacy was that of being Herod the butcher. Now, he certainly was Herod the builder, and this is why history calls him and knows him as Herod the Great, because he did build so many things. But yet, if you go to that part of the world today, those things are really not there anymore, or just remnants of those things. But what really was lasting was the fact that he was such a hateful person, and that is his legacy. And instead of having this great legacy that he can be proud of, he ends up being a negative footnote, just a footnote, in the big story of Jesus. So I'm going to ask you now a little bit about legacy. What do you want to leave as your legacy? Is your legacy going to be that, whenever you're gone from this life and someone talks about you in relationship to others, or you in a relationship to the light of the world, what is your legacy going to be? Is it going to be that of a person who demanded their own light, or a person who was happy to point others to the true light? Is your legacy going to be that of resisting God, or humbly submitting your life to God and worshiping God? Is your legacy going to be my way or God's way? What will your story be after you are gone from this earth? Also, Pastor Stanley mentions more than once this idea of 5 miles away from the Son of God. It's interesting that Jesus was born just 5 miles away from where King Herod was. It wasn't that far, but yet King Herod still didn't recognize him. My question to you is it possible that God is closer than you think, but yet even this season you're not recognizing him? You're not seeing him as the light of your life and the light of the world. I mean, he could be just 5 minutes away. He could be just across the street somehow. Is it possible that there's a nativity scene that you might drive past several times this season, but yet you just don't recognize it because you're so caught up in all the other fake lights that are going on, screaming for your attention this time of year? Now, as I close, I'm just going to encourage you to do what Pastor Stanley encouraged you to do, and that is re-engage with Christ this season. Re-engage with the light of the world. Allow him to have control of your life. Allow him to protect your life. Willfully give that to him. Reduce the stress level in your life by giving that to him and not insisting on it all being you. remember, God is closer than you think. Hey, thanks for watching this review of the second week of the Zoom groups, and I hope to see you back for the third and final week of the Zoom groups called Light of the World. Thanks.